So are the other people? Oh, here's Leo. I know that, let's see, Federico won't be here, and Daniela won't.
Also Daniela won't be here, and also Bean won't be here because...
Yeah, and Asunda?
Asunda is coming.
Okay. We're live, okay. So we should just go ahead even though is Luca going to?
Yeah, I think he's coming.
Okay. Here comes Sundara. Thank you everyone for attending today. Getting a couple minutes late start. Today we'll be changing gears quite a bit. As you know, this series of lectures is about typology and diachrony, and I believe the two belong together, as I've said before. But you know, in practice, some of these lectures are more focused on topics of grammar and function, and other lectures are more focused on topics of language change. So today we'll be going back to talking about language change. And after an introductory few slides giving you the framework and some more detail, then I'll be going in depth into mathematical modeling of aspects of language change, and particularly selection. And then at the end, I will talk a little bit about the first step in the process, generation of variation. Frankly, because I and my collaborators have not actually been, modeled that generation of variation yet, but that's next on the list. Okay, so in the biological evolutionary model of language and language change that I've described and worked in, I said that language change occurs in two steps, and I'm going to clarify this in a couple of ways. So the two steps are called generation of variation and selection, mainly terms taken from evolutionary biology and philosophers of biology. And it looks at the face of it that this is basically the same as innovation versus propagation that people working in language change talk about, particularly socio-historical linguists. But they're not quite the same. So generation of variation, it occurs in the replication process. And if you recall, the replication process is the speaker construing a situation they want to verbalize with respect to prior situations for which the selected linguistic structures have been used before. And one of the things I mentioned about replication is, in general, it's not entirely faithful. People make changes in the process. So in other words, a speaker chooses to replicate a variant V, but ends up producing a replicate W that is qualitatively different in some way. Simple example is using gonna instead of going to for the English future. Of course, I'm talking about a point in the past history of English when gonna was first introduced. So the effect of this is that when you produce W instead of V, so some slightly different form of the variant, you have created a branch in this replicator or lineage. So basically, you've produced many variants from one variant that existed beforehand. So as I said, generation and variation is not quite the same as innovation. It's close, but it's not quite the same, the way innovation is usually understood in historical linguistics. In historical linguistics, you generally think of it as at the population level, the level of the whole speech community or of your corpus that you have, and you see the first occurrence of some novel form or novel usage. So innovation in that strict definition is the first time anyone in that speech community produces W instead of V, a new variant. However, generation and variation is something that happens basically in the speaker's production process. Not entirely, as we'll see later, but we'll start from that point. So basically it occurs anytime there's a qualitative change where you produce W instead of V by any individual. So if I am trying to say going to and I reduce it to gonna, and then creates a new variant, but if somebody else in the speech community who maybe I don't even know produces gonna when they're trying to produce going to, they reduce it, that would be another generation of variation step. It's just by a different individual. And in fact, if I am repeatedly trying to, or choosing to express going to, but then changing it to gonna, each one of those is an act of generation or variation. Selection contrasts with that. It also occurs in the replication process. So we're talking about these two steps. They both occur in the replication process. But selection differentially replicates one variant, W, relative to another variant, V. In other words, selection has to operate on at least two variants. You're picking one instead of the other to produce in the utterance. So in other words, selection presupposes generation of variation. You can't select when there's only one. There's no choice. There's no alternatives. However, of course, if you think about it for a moment, generation of variation does not presuppose selection. So it is logically possible to consider a theory of language change, which is only a one-step model consisting of generation of variation. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. There are people who have proposed such models. As I said, we haven't modeled that yet, so I can't say too much about what modeling would produce. Selection can and often does lead to the extinction of the variant selected against. So if you're differentially producing W instead of V, eventually there will be no more new Vs. And that basically means that the extinction, that variant will go extinct, or another way of putting it is you're pruning a branch from the lineage. You're reducing the number of branches. So you can think of that as one from many. Before you had a period where people were replicating V or W, and then if W is differentially replicated, then eventually people will stop replicating V and will be down to just one variant. And that we usually think of as a change from V to W in the history of the language. So that's kind of the basic structure of this generation of variation versus selection and how it differs from it. Well, I didn't actually go here. Let me go and talk about propagation. So selection is not quite the same as propagation because propagation is generally thought of as a novel variant spreading across speakers. But differential replication of W instead of V can occur in the productions of a single speaker. I talk all the time, I'm replicating linguemes all the time, and I can repeatedly choose W instead of V, repeatedly say gonna instead of going to, and just stop saying going to. And that can happen with an individual speaker. Of course, it can also happen across the speech community. And in fact, this utterance selection model, which I described to you in the abstract, and I will show you again very shortly, does have a mechanism for replication across speakers, so to speak. Basically, the idea is the first speaker replicates a variant from her store, her usage-based representation of her knowledge about her language. and then produces it in a perceivable medium, that is, a medium where that can be shared with another speaker, sound or gesture. The second speaker then perceives that replication in the produced utterance, auditorily for sound and visually for gesture, and then adds it to his store. And so if the first speaker produces a novel variant, then the other speaker, the second speaker, will add that novel variant to their store too. So that's how you get the transfer process. And we will see at the end of today's lecture how that mechanism causes generation of variation, namely that mechanism for replication, quote, across speakers, because it's conversation, it's communication, it is interaction between two speakers. And I'll explain that in more detail, and that will be this afternoon. So the big picture here, now that I've explained generation of variation versus selection a little bit, is the aim is to integrate functional linguistics, cognitive linguistics, and sociolinguistics. And this is a hypothesis of how it works. I actually proposed this hypothesis 30 years ago, which was before I wrote the book, although it then grounds everything that's in the book on language change and all the following work that we've done. So basically the idea is that generation of variation is caused by cognitive and discourse functional factors which are common to all human beings at all times. That is, it's basically kind of universal properties of human cognition, human perception and production skills, physiological skills, and human social interaction. Selection is caused by social factors which vary across societies, varies across members of societies, and across time. So one's attitude towards other speakers differs from person to person and from time to time and across cultures, of course. So this hypothesis underlies the theory and model presented in these lectures. But it's not the only hypothesis, and in fact it's not the only hypothesis that has been proposed, as I'll refer to at the end of this afternoon. But that is the hypothesis that we're working on. It's basically the hypothesis of socio-historical linguistics, going back to the groundbreaking work of Weinreich, Leboff, and Herzog in 1968, where they basically said, as socially oriented linguists looking at language change, they were going to focus on propagation or selection because that's governed by social factors, and they considered the generation of variation to be what they called the riddle of actuation. When does a novel form actually get produced and why? And treated that as outside the domain of socio-historical linguistics. So their research, the sociolinguistic research, assumes you have variation already, and then it's just focusing on how do some variants get selected and others not selected. And in fact, that's why we will be focusing on that. That is, I and my collaborators, that I'll be whose work. So we'll be, the rest of this morning and most of this afternoon we'll be showing you a series of case studies where we mathematically modeled selection processes in language change and came up with some interesting results. So that means we'll be looking at mechanisms and models for propagation, or more precisely, selection of a variant in a speech community. So basically what we're doing here, just to say briefly as an overview before I get into the details, is there are a number of different theories about how language change happens. That is, how selection or propagation happens. In the speech community, these theories have been around for a while. As you're going to see, Leboff, he'll be citing earlier linguists from the early 20th century. And then there are other more recent theories. And so the idea that we have is that we can actually use mathematical modeling to give us some insight about which of these theories are more likely to be the actual describe the actual mechanism underlying language change. So there are two mechanisms that have been widely cited and widely used in sociolinguistics. The first was Leboff cites from Sturtevant, a historical linguist in the early 20th century, the association of particular forms of speaking with the social traits of opposing social groups. So in other words, having weighting of a linguistic variant depending on its association with a particular social group. And the weighting of variants, in turn, has been attributed to various social measures, such as prestige, in some cases covert prestige, when something which seems like not the standard variant is actually favored. LePage and Tabaret-Keller generalized this to the notion of acts of identity. What social group are you identifying with? Salikoko-Mofwani extended this idea to the formation of creoles, which I talked about on Tuesday of last week, in terms of speaker choices of forms in creole formation, forms coming from different parent communities. But Labov also cites the alternative view, which was Leonard Bloomfield, again, early American linguist in the 20th century. Changes in interlocutor frequencies, which are in turn the result of changes in social preferences and attitudes. So in other words, how you talk depends on who you talk to, or how often you talk to those persons. And so interlocutor frequencies are considered to be a reflection of social network structure. This social network structure basically describes who you interact with and how often and in what social context. So this theory is most closely associated with the Milroys in social network theories of how language change is propagated. It's also a theory that basically underlies the theory that Trudgill proposed for new dialect formation, and he called it determinism, basically because it did not involve the weighting, the social weighting of variants. This is one of the theories we'll be testing, so I won't say more about that now. So an evolutionary framework for language change our model basically, provides a model of both the Sturtevant-inspired mechanism and the Bloomfield-inspired mechanism. It also turns out that it provides a model of two other mechanisms. So this is an interesting case where I collaborated, and my collaborators, who are statistical physicists, not trained in linguistics, developed a model where there were, again, two logically possible or mathematically possible other mechanisms. And it turns out they also correspond to theories that have been proposed or mechanisms that have been proposed by sociolinguists or historical linguists. And so the evolutionary framework allows us to formally model the theories of these different mechanisms underlying language change and evaluate their plausibility. And I should say their plausibility for particular features of language change. We're not saying that only one of these is operating. We're saying what you observe in language change might be attributable to one or the other of these mechanisms. So now I'm going to introduce some terms that are more in the kind of biological terminology that I've introduced here last week. So the Sturtevant theory corresponds to what we would call replicator selection. This is in operation when the replicator, a linguistic variant, their weights are asymmetric or unequal. So we favor one variant over the other. And the presumption behind this is that it's because of some social valuation that we assign to one variant over another. And I should mention, when you think about modeling, and I'll talk more about modeling in general in a few minutes, is that modeling can just say, okay, we have an asymmetrically weight, two variants with asymmetric weighting. Where that weighting comes from, mathematics doesn't tell you. We as linguists hypothesize that it comes, in this case, from social group identification. And so you have to work, when you're comparing theories, there has to be some kind of common denominator. So everybody believes it's a social factor, and the question is, what kind of social factor and how does it operate in the actual process? The other kind of selection we call interactor selection. And in order to look at interactor selection, the best thing to do at first is to make the replicator weights equal or symmetric, so we know it's not that's causing the phenomenon. And when these interactions are symmetric, then that interactor speaker selection is neutral. This is the Bloomfield theory. How you talk depends on who you talk to, but you treat everybody you talk to alike. It's just a matter of exposure to different variants from your different interlocutors. So here's a little more description of this. This is a diagram that my collaborator put, so it's sort of a mathematical thing. So you say you have an innovator, and then people follow the innovator, so those dots change to a pinker color. So that's an adopter of the innovator. But it's interchangeable, so what happens is if it's a different variant that has a different weight, then it'll get, and it's propagated by the same person. So it doesn't matter what the variant is, but as long as it's weighted positively, it'll spread in the same way. In the Bloomfield-inspired mechanism, this is the network structure, so that is a network there, that little graph structure showing basically who talks to whom. So you got your innovator again, then it spreads again, but this time it spreads because the innovator talks to that other person, the first pink dot, and who then talks to the next person, who then talks to the next person. So the way the innovator speaks gets passed on that chain of interactions. That's the path followed by the innovation. And then it gets symmetric. We're going to treat it as symmetric, since all that matters is who you talk to. It doesn't matter who actually says it first. It'll go to the people who they talk to first, and then it gets passed on down the chain, like in the other direction on the right-hand side of the diagram. So I mentioned that there are actually two others. There's four of them. The third one is when the interactions between the people are asymmetric. That is, I talk to you and I give what you say back to me more weight than when I talk to someone else. And we call that weighted interactor selection. So there it's asymmetric. So it's a plausible model for accommodation, accommodation is basically a more local or more transitory effect. So I talk to you, and so then I start talking like you, shifting my productions closer to yours. But then I stop talking to you and I talk to someone else, they're talking differently, and then I accommodate them as well. However, there's also a theory that has been advocated by a number of sociolinguists for what I call in general adopter group theories of propagation. It's a theory that was associated by a sociologist named Rogers, someone who was looking at technological innovation across societies. And that's like a more global or more lasting effect, because it's an attitude towards a kind of a more stable attitude towards a particular individual or group of individuals. So in other words, I generally think, admire you, and therefore I will talk like you. I don't care so much about somebody else, so then I don't try to talk like the other person. It's not specific to just the immediate conversation. So this is Roger's model. He has an elaborate one where he has 5 groups. The first is the innovators, who are most receptive to innovations and will transmit them to other members of the community. Then you have early adopters, so these are opinion leaders in the community who are respected by the rest of the community. They'll pick up those innovations from the innovators. Then the early majority are those who willingly adopt an innovation, but only after the early adopters have done so. So it's like everybody here is waiting to see who's going to do what, and then they'll follow those persons. They'll follow the persons who they think of as the early adopters, but they won't do it until someone else does it. Then you have the late majority, the ones who are slow down and wait until the majority members of the community have adopted the innovation. And then you have the laggards, those who resist innovations and possess almost no opinion leadership. So this is a phenomenon about Roger's theory, which has been adopted by all of the others, which is there's really two sides to it. So each group is considered as being more or less receptive to adopting new innovations, but they're also being considered as being more or less likely to be followed by others. So the laggards, they both resist the innovations, but nobody also follows them either. And you can imagine you could separate these and make a more complex theory, but on the whole, the sociolinguists haven't done that. Instead, the sociolinguists have actually made theories that have fewer categories than the Rogers model. So Leboff just has a 2-way division into leaders and followers instead of that 5-way division. following some sociology work from the 50s. The Milroys cite Rogers, but they only focus their attention on leaders and early adopters, the ones who do use innovations first, or prefer innovations first. Sankoff and Blondeau, in a study that we'll talk about, describes early adopters, late adopters, a late majority-like group, and laggards. So they have 4 categories, right, closer to the Rogers model. And then Nevalainen et al., another study that we also focus on, describes progressive, in-between, and conservative for the series of changes that they look at in the history of English. Thank you. Now there's another model that is not really talked about, and that's neutral evolution. Basically, there's no selection operating at all. Recall I said that you don't have to have selection. Selection requires variation to have happened already, but you don't have to have selection. And in fact, biologists call this neutral evolution or genetic drift because propagation, that is, V taking over at the expense of W or vice versa, that can happen just by random processes, random fluctuations in a finite population. Because remember, this is all probabilistic. So it's neutral evolution or genetic drift. I cite a couple of linguists who appeal to that theory, that Trudgill theory I mentioned before, and then another theory that was published a few years ago. And the important thing for linguists to know is genetic drift does not mean Sapere's concept of drift. Sapere's concept of drift means everybody's going to start changing from an old variant to a new one in a kind of mysterious process. And we're trying to take a little of the mystery out of this process here. So neutral evolution is basically the absence of that. And we do not rule that out in our model. However, our model includes other, these types of replicator and interactor selection. So here's a summary, a kind of a mathematical summary of these selection mechanisms. So we have both the variants and the speakers, which are the replicators and the interactors in our evolutionary theory. So replicator selection is when the variants are weighted asymmetrically. Weighted interactor selection, it doesn't say anything about replicator selection, but it says that speakers are weighted asymmetrically. Some are treated as leaders and others as followers. Neutral interactor selection, the speakers and the variants are symmetric, but the interaction frequencies, how often you talk to someone or how little you talk to someone, that's unequal. And neutral evolution is where nothing's happening and everybody talks to everybody or has the same likelihood of talking to anybody else in the speech community. And you can have all of these happening at once. It could be the case, and in fact, I will argue by the end of today that it is the case that all 4 of these mechanisms, or at least 3 out of 4, operate. Interestingly, we don't have much evidence about network structure. We have some. So they're all 4 operating, and so the question is, how do you tease them apart, and how do you figure out which phenomena, linguistic phenomena, can be accounted for by which mechanism? And one of the things I want to say here is that the mechanisms are listed by strength. So the strongest one, the easiest one to get the effects, in other words, is replicator selection. And then they're progressively weaker from there. And so your typical strategy as a scientist, trying to come up with the, quote, simplest explanation is to basically start from the weakest selection, see if you can get the effect you're interested in explaining. And then if you can't, moving up to the progressively stronger selection mechanisms, which means more complexity. Okay, so as I said, we'll now try to model these mechanisms. So if I can introduce to you our model in a little more detail, but I'll illustrate them first. So imagine wearing a hoodie as a social behavior, so not a linguistic example, and someone who is all familiar to you. This is from a long time ago, back when not everybody thought Facebook was a bad idea. So let's say you want to say that wearing a hoodie, a social behavior is responsible or due to replicator selection. Well, the way of describing that would be to say, I wear a hoodie because hoodies are cool. I've associated hoodies with coolness. It does nothing particular to do with you. That is the fact that Mark Zuckerberg wears a hoodie. It's already cool. If it was weighted interactive selection, it's I'm wearing a hoodie because you're cool and you usually wear a hoodie. It has nothing particular to do with hoodies. So it's something that the value is associated with the person, not with the behavior. Neutral interactive selection is I wear a hoodie because I hang out with you a lot and you usually wear a hoodie. It has nothing to do particularly with you. That is that I have some extra special respect for you or that I have some special attraction to hoodies. And neutral evolution is just, I just wear a hoodie because I just feel like it right now and it has nothing particular to do with anything at all. I just, stick my arm in the closet and pull out something and it turns out to be a hoodie. It's just a totally random process. So the conundrum, which is true for sociolinguistics as much as it would be in trying to explain the behavior for social fashions, is in all of these scenarios, I'm observed wearing a hoodie, and if that's all you know, you don't really know why I'm doing it. And maybe even I don't know why I'm doing it, as we'll see. So in other words, you're talking about essentially internal cognitive process. There's a social cognitive process of social attitudes, either towards people or towards hoodies, a history of interactions with other people that you can't observe at the certain moment. And the same is true whether we're talking about a linguistic variant. So that's part of the empirical problem, is how do you tell what they're doing, why people are doing that? So if it's something to do with the speaker or the variant, you could survey attitudes towards social groups or towards linguistic variants. The problem here is that most of these attitudes appear to be subconscious. So if you ask somebody, why do you wear a hoodie? They may not really know why they wear a hoodie. And then if they give you an answer, it may not really reflect it. I mean, this is sort of the anecdotal phenomenon that we know that there are certain stigmatized linguistic variants and people deny that they actually produce them, but they're actually producing them while they deny that they're producing them. That's sort of the extreme case. Now for neutral interactive selection, the social network structure, so you can survey networks and survey people, ask who do you talk to, how often do you talk to them, do you talk to them at home or at work or in church, school, whatever. It's not really possible, you can't really get a thing because you really want to know how often, and people aren't good at judging frequency. So it's not really possible in practical terms for real networks. Perhaps with online networks, if you can get this proprietary data from the network, the social media companies, you might be able to do it. And I'll show you an example of that from an unpublished paper. And it's also impractical across time. You can go out and record people like sociolinguists do in linguistic behavior, but in fact, you can't do that with a whole society or even something as narrow as the city of Rome, for example. So instead we can try to model it. So instead of trying to actually assess it, we can try to model it. So that allows us to overcome practical constraints in data collection. There are practical constraints in computer time, as we learned. So I have a few issues about models. We recently published a handbook chapter, which I won't be talking about here, which actually goes into more detail about the pros and cons of modeling, but I'll try to hit the high points here. So a model is basically only as good as what you put in it. So the first thing is you have to start simple. I've seen linguists construct very complicated models, but then you don't know which thing in the model is actually producing the behavior that's interesting. So you start simple to isolate the mechanisms, even though it's obviously not a complete or even realistic model of linguistic interaction. Only put in what you believe is real. So don't put in something that's a shortcut that you think might help things out that you don't believe is actually should be part of the model. Again, people might do that to try to get an effect. And then the other thing that people also need to do is if you have a model where you've got different variables in it, in a mathematical sense, you have to test all the values of a variable, from 0 to 1, if it's one of those kind of normalized variables, or 0 to n. Don't assume that you see it working when it's, the variable is 0.5, and you don't just assume it's working then. Check to see if it works at 0.25, 0.75, 0, or 1, to find out really what's going on. How robust is the phenomenon? Does the parameter even matter? And we'll have an example where we discovered a parameter basically didn't matter. And modeling must be combined with empirical data. And that's the solution I have to that problem is I'm the linguist familiar with the empirical data, and I collaborated with statistical physicists who did the modeling and the programming, the computational model. And finally, to recognize the limits of any model. No model is ever going to be complete. It's only useful to the extent that you can turn this into a quantifiable variable that can be combined in mathematical relations with other variables in an equation. So there's just some things we won't be able to do. So, modeling reality, going back to this problem of how do you choose between these alternative mechanisms of selection. And in real societies, all of those mechanisms may be operating, and they're too large and too complex to collect data directly on, the point I made before. So we can model out speaker behavior, and we can observe what happens to the model when confronted with empirically observed patterns and rates of language change. So in other words, we have empirical observations, and what we're going to see is whether a model with certain variables in it can actually produce that kind of empirically observed pattern. And the results can at least narrow the range of possible mechanisms to account for these patterns of change. So I'll be showing you most of our studies. I'm not showing a recent study where the results actually didn't narrow the range of possible mechanisms very well. And that may be because sociolinguists didn't provide the observations that would be helpful. So at least the models could tell you, like, if you really want to distinguish these theories, you need to collect this other kind of social or linguistic data. So these are my collaborators. This started when I was teaching at the University of Manchester around 2002 or 2003. So after I published the book, and then a colleague of mine was actually playing tennis with a colleague of these people, and got to talking, and this other person asked, well, do you know somebody interested in modeling language change? And he said, as a matter of fact, yes. So that's how I got started. They're all in a branch called statistical physics. At this point, Alan McCain, he was the professor at Manchester. Richard Blythe was his postdoc. Gareth Baxter was his PhD student. And of course, time has moved on, so Alan has retired and hasn't been actively working with us for quite a while now. And Richard and Gareth and I are the ones kind of moving forward, and we're all dispersed in different places, in different countries and different continents. So it means that progress is rather slow and kind of jerky. We work on, get something together, and then there's a gap before we get back to it again. Okay, so we call this thing the utterance selection model. That's because I called it the theory of utterance selection in the 2000 book. It was actually first published in a physics journal back in 2006, so after we'd worked out the details and got some initial results. So in this model, a speaker has a store of variant frequencies. This is the grammar for variant frequencies for different variants. So this is basically the usage-based model, but it's also the variationist model in sociolinguistics. A linguistic variable has multiple variants, and speakers track their frequencies. That's a fundamental underlying assumption of all these sociolinguistic theories that language change. And so we're going to model conversations. So each time step, pick speakers, call them I and J, to interact with a probability, capital G, I, J, That's social network effects, who you talk to. And then speakers produce a sample of tokens, speaker I producing a variant V with a probability. The probability is this XIV, but the 1 plus SIV is the selection, the replicator selection. So that's our variant valuation. The basic thing, that's the basic neutral evolution. So one of the things, that fundamental results about neutral evolution is that's basically causes the frequency effects of language change that people like Joan Bybee and Martin Hasselmatt and many other people have argued for. So the speakers produce these tokens, so the listeners hear those tokens, and of course the speakers hear their own tokens, so there's that also happening. Speakers add sample frequencies to the store, with speaker I giving weight Hij to speaker J's utterances. That's accommodation or adopter groups. And then after the conversational interaction's over, then you renormalize the store and return to step one. So basically you change your grammar. That's the usage-based view, is the grammar changes as a result of the interactions you have with other speakers. And in this model, it's basically the variant frequencies change. And it's a rather complicated process, as you see, dependent on social interaction effects, variant valuation, frequency effects, and accommodation or adopter group phenomena. So using the terminology that I've given you, these are all different kinds of selection: neutral interactor selection, replicator selection, weighted interactor selection, and then neutral evolution, where there's no selection proceeding. So that's the basic model. So you can see the underlying approach is a usage-based model of speaker knowledge about their language, combined with the kind of standard sociolinguistic model of tracking variant frequencies, recognizing variants, and then interacting with other speakers, and having social attitudes towards both the other speakers and towards the variants, possibly. So the first case study is the emergence of New Zealand English. So this is one of those new dialects that Trudgill proposed a theory about. So here's some basic historical facts, call them idealized, in the sense that we simplify the complex history of the introduction of English to these islands. So it was populated by immigrants from the mid-19th century onwards. It's one of the most recent European colonial invasions, basically. So stage one was that immigrants' dialects were largely unchanged, but they were brought into contact with each other. This is based on the assumption, well, we know that people came from different parts of Great Britain, and we also know those different parts of Great Britain had quite different accents and dialects. And so that's the first, the immigrant generation. The next generation is the ones that were the first native-born New Zealanders. And so the observation we have, and the thing that made the study possible, it was recordings that were done by New Zealand Public Radio of people, older people in the 1940s. So people who are actually the immigrant generation was gone, but the first generation of native New Zealanders was still there. So they could record their language. And it turned out they used different mixtures of the variants available to them. Stage three, you have individuals from the following generation focused on the majority variant, so they selected the majority variant, leading to rapid homogenization of dialect across the entire community. So in other words, the community size was around 100,000 speakers, and the fixation, i.e. the rapid homogenization of the dialect to a single dialect that we now think of as the New Zealand English dialect, was 50 to 60 years. So the Gordon et al. 2004 was the big detailed empirical publication of the empirical study. Trudgill's is a separate book he wrote advocating a particular theory of how this happened, and that's what we're going to look at here. So he focused on Bloomfield's principle of density. For time, I won't read this quote in detail, but it's basically the social network phenomenon of how you speak depends on who you talk to. without any kind of social valuation. So Trudgill called this determinism. That is, there's no social selection mechanisms operating. Speakers just replicate what they hear around them in language use, and then the majority, the variant that's in the majority that they hear, wins out, and it takes 2 generations for that to happen. From our point of view, he's proposing a theory where there's no replicator selection, there's no weighted interactor selection, everybody's treated equally in a social point of view. So you only have neutral interactor selection, who you talk to, and neutral evolution, frequency, basically random processes that are influenced or determined by frequency. So the basic assumption is that there's this majority rule. Well, that turns out to basically hold. So there's the initial frequencies of the various kinds of changes they talked about. They're all phonological changes. And you can see that all but 2 of these were had the majority. So these social factors that were associated with the variance origins, like Southeast England, London area being higher value socially, that seems to be suppressed. And as I mentioned before, neutral interactor selection, the fixation probability is equal to the initial token frequency. I should mention in passing that a linguist, this is something about, I think of more the humanities versus hard science way of looking at things. In the humanities, we'd see those 2, and this is what Trudgill actually did, is he saw those 2 variants that were under 50% and felt he had to come up for an explanation about why those particular variants succeeded even though they were under 50%. Whereas my collaborator said, see, I think this is, the most likely outcomes, majority variance fixed. Observed outcome is a relative likelihood, 10%. So it's like, yeah, you 10% not making it, that's just part of the probabilistic process. You don't have to have a special explanation for why those 2 variants succeeded even though they were in the minority. And so the model supports the dialect mixture hypothesis. So the basic hypothesis, you jumble all this together, the majority of variant will win out. But it turns out that it's more complicated than just that, because his hypothesis is this process involves only neutral evolution and neutral interactor selection, a social network fact. So we thought about how can we test this hypothesis. It's actually quite a strong hypothesis because by limiting himself to 2 of the 4 mechanisms, it actually made it easier for us to model that phenomenon. And it also made it increased the likelihood that maybe his theory would be disconfirmed. It's a strong hypothesis. And the parameter that my collaborator said the best way to test this is to look at the likelihood that New Zealand English would emerge in the time period observed. And I should mention at this point, so I said it took about 2 generations, 50 to 60 years. There is a big survey of pigeons and creoles by a creolist named John Holm. And in fact, I mentioned his work on Monday or Tuesday last week. And in discussing various creoles around the world, it also seemed to take just 2 generations. That is, 2 generations that were born in the colony where the creole emerged. So this seems to be actually a general phenomenon of 2 generations, not specific to this New Zealand English situation. We just have more data about it. So a well-known result is that neutral evolution and neutral interactor selection slow down as the population size increases. So it happens quickly if your population is 100. It happens a lot more slowly if the population is 100,000. So basically what we had to do was set up a model, and I'm going to go into this, and I can't say I have especially now in the distance of 17 years that I remember all of the mathematical justifications here. So I'll show you some equations and talk about the variables. But the basic idea is we tried to figure out how many interactions would be needed to fix that variant, and then had to make some estimates. Essentially, estimates that gave Trugill's theory the best chance. You know, estimates, the lowest estimates that would give his theory the best chance to succeed. So we equated the number of interactions to a single speaker's lifetime, and then asked how long a speaker's memory time windows for remembering and forgetting must be for this to be achieved. So one of the things that isn't talked too much about in language change is if you want language change to happen, you want old variants to die out, the speakers have to forget them. Because if they're still there in the speaker's knowledge of their language, they will still could replicate them. So you'll never get rid of them unless they forget the old tokens, the exemplars in their mind. Since Trugill models uses neutral interactive selection only, we set that Hij probability equal and make it proportional to a new parameter, lowercase h. Now, it turns out the results that they drew, this is one of these cases I mentioned, will hold for all different network structures. So ones where everybody talks to everybody else, and ones where people are much more selective about who they talk to. So they're independent of those values of G. Well, that was helpful because then we didn't have to worry about G. So for any wet network structure, that's the G, any G, you have this equation, and we have a bunch of variables in here. So the time windows is how long it's going to take. That's what we're trying to figure out, is can you make this change happen in 60 years in our model with all these other factors and without appealing to weighted interactive selection or replicator selection. So the number of speakers matters. We told you that was significant in the rate. Lifetime token exposure, so how much do people hear in their lifetime? The forgetting threshold, as I told you, you're never going to get the change to happen if they don't forget. The initial variant frequency, so majority variance more likely to fix faster. Tokens per interaction, so how much people talk at one time, and then the interaction strength, which is, you know, how much do we accommodate to everybody else. So basically we're seeking an upper bound on the shortest window in the model for a wide range of interaction strengths. So in other words, we can fix things like the number of speakers, the forgetting threshold, the initial variant frequency, and the lifetime exposure, but we don't really know tokens per interaction and interaction strength. So those two variables, we have to look at all the parameters to see whether they actually reach or can do it in 50 to 60 years. Okay, so we take that and we say number of speakers went from 100,000 to 600,000 in the time period in question. So we're generous to Trugill, so we'll say it's the smaller number because that makes it go to change, the change can fix faster. The lifetime token exposure, we estimated by looking at the rate of production of variance in the ONZE, that's this public radio corpus. So we take the smallest value, so in order to make it work. For X, we use the largest, which one is X? Initial variant frequency, we use the largest value because the more there are to start with, the faster it fixes. Going from 75 to 100 is a lot easier than going from 32% to 100. The forgetting thing, I looked at I got some advice from the psychological literature. Well, first, we assume that tokens decay to 1% counts as forgetting, so we don't make it go all the way to 0. There's an exponential decay rate, so it would take forever, literally, to go to 0. And then the TMEM, how much memory time. So we assume that the infant's shortest time window for remembering which was 2 days based on some psychological work about memory, because of course, like I said, the faster you forget stuff, shorter time window, the quicker we're going to get to the new dialect, the fixation of the new variants. So that's why we call this giving them the best chance. So we're not stacking the deck against us at all. We're doing the opposite. So the way we should interpret this result is that a dashed line is what the model needs to reach. and different possibilities of this HT. That was the thing where we had to basically test it along a bunch of different variables. And you can see that's an exponential scale on the bottom. And it turns out the memory time just doesn't make it. So even at T star at 10 to the fifth, the lowest one, that solid black line is still well below the dashed line. And may not look like that, but the vertical dimension is also an exponential scale. So we concluded, it's a log-log scale, that you can't really do it in 60 years, even with these very generous assumptions to Trudgill's theory, with only neutral evolution and neutral interactive selection. And we made a lot of idealizations. So if we talk about more realistic models of what really happened in the history of New Zealand, is there were new generations of speakers. Well, that decreases the fluidity of the collective grammar and increases fixation times. Incorporating observed immigration of new speakers delays the onset of this consensus process and increases fixation times. And then, of course, the declining receptiveness of age that most of us believe in when we talk about language learning, including learning new dialects, puts a brake on the dynamics and increasing fixation times. In other words, even if we made the model more realistic in terms of demography and language acquisition, it would actually make it even harder for the model to succeed. So our idealization, again, favored Trudgill's hypothesis, and unfortunately for him, didn't work. Of course, if you have replicator selection, that's a much more powerful mechanism. So if you introduce that, avoiding a variance, it can overcome all of these barriers to trying for propagation. That's why we don't go to it right away, because we knew it would work. You just jack up the weight high enough, the asymmetry. So I have some final speculations about what might really be happening here. Basically we're suggesting that replicator selection and weighted interactor selection must play a role. So how would that happen? Well, first, immigration largely ceased around 1890, so the speech community was more stable. By that time, infrastructure was built, which allowed for more interaction between New Zealanders. Schooling became universal around the same time. And all of that, all of that introduces social weighting of variance and social weighting of different subgroups of the community. Now, in some sense, we've already incorporated these factors. We had no immigration, fully connected social network. But it's possible that replicator selection was essentially due to the emergence of social structure in New Zealand society. So it wasn't imported from Britain, but it was created over those two generations. Like people came to realize what they were. And even gender roles, which are a little harder, as we all know, a little harder to dislodge, probably persisted, and therefore the kind of gender-driven factors in language change that are familiar to us from much sociolinguistic research also probably played a role. So in other words, there were kind of factors that would lead to social evaluation of either groups of speakers or the variance. Okay, now we'll go on to the S-curves and the mechanisms of propagation and language change. So now we basically tested a particular hypothesis that was very strong and found that it was a little too strong to account for the phenomenon. Though it did account for majority variance winning, so clearly sort of neutral random processes do play a significant role there. So this is just a couple of graphs of data from some publications just to show something which you are probably familiar with and linguists have talked about and historical linguists have talked about for a long time, which is that when you have a new incoming variant, which is the one that's in the sort of greenish line with the X, the go future, the motion future of Brazilian Portuguese, it follows an S-shaped curve, a slow start, a rapid rise, ending with a slow final case. And they call that an S-curve because it looks sort of like an S. And the contrast would be a fast start and then a slow ending. That's called an R-curve. And a slow start and a fast immediate ending is called a J-curve. I mention that because We'll see that a little later. Okay, it also happens in this particular case with Brazilian Portuguese that there were a couple of other variants that were popular for a while but then dropped out. And it's an interesting phenomenon which we won't talk about now, but it's something that is certainly worth thinking about later. And then the synthetic future is that blue diamond on the left, which basically drops in an inverse S-curve that's inverse of the incoming variant that took over. Another example is French negation. So the ne negator got basically declined, and then the use of pas as the other part of French negation rose in an S-curve shape, and there were a couple of other competitors to pas as the like point and mi that were also used, but they didn't get very far and they dropped out, and pas took over. So that's just two examples of many, many examples in the historical linguistics literature where we have quantitative data to show that the type of curve is an S-curve. And so it's widely accepted by socio-historical linguists it's the normal course of propagation at the population level for an incoming variant, a new variant for a linguistic variable. And I documented a bunch of these examples from the literature. So the question we posed ourselves is, which of these four mechanisms produces an S-curve trajectory of the propagation of a novel variant? So again, we can now model that. We're looking at this all at a population level, which is good because that's where the S-curve emerges. So if there's neutral evolution, you get this kind of, first you get most innovations fail. That's actually a true fact. If you take the verbalization perspective, you see that most innovations are not conventional and they never become conventional. So that actually, it's just like with the majority rules with the Trudgill. It is operating, it's just not the only thing. Of course, it's no selection, so it's kind of hard to say that it's operating. It's just there all the time, and then we add selection mechanisms on top of that. However, successful trajectories exhibit large fluctuations, and that is generally not observed. You see either an S-curve if the change is successful, or you see a kind of truncated S-curve if the change is going along and then for some reason it stopped. Those are the kinds of, that's what you observe in the documented cases. Neutral interactor selection is exactly the same. You get most innovations failing and you get random fluctuations. So those two mechanisms, they're very weak, so they can't even give us something that looks like an S-curve. So some people made proposals about boosting, which is that an incoming variant could be boosted either to get a low frequency variant across that 50% threshold to become the majority variant, or to cause a high frequency variant to go to completion of a change. That's basically a nonlinear mathematical function based on the input and the frequency of the variant in the speaker's store, that is memory in the usage-based model. It has a little problem, which is the threshold problem. So the threshold problem is, how do you get that minority variant boosted? If you're boosting the more frequent variant, well, at the beginning, the new variant is not the more frequent variant. The conventional variant is the more frequent one. So it just crushes it, basically. So how do you get it over that hump? Once you get it over the hump, then it goes very quickly to fixation, as you can see by the lines in the upper table that start above 0.5, and they just head up to the completion. And the other ones, instead, they get suppressed. On the other hand, if you have the opposite, so people have proposed, well, instead of boosting the new variant, let's downplay the old variant. So underproduce the majority variant, allow the new one to come in. Well, the trouble is, so the new one does then increase in its frequency because it's being boosted relative to the old majority, but as soon as it itself becomes the majority, it's stuck. And so you get the stable coexistence at 50-50 that you see on the lower table in the slide. So then what about weighted interactor selection? So this is this Lebov type leader-followers model. And as I mentioned earlier with these models, when you divide the society into groups like leaders and followers, there has to be two things going on. One is that they overproduce an innovation, but the other is that other people pay attention to how they speak. So both of these things have to be true of the leader group, and then conversely of the follower group, both of them have to be false. They hesitate to use the innovation, and nobody pays attention to them. Certainly not the people in the leader group, the more advanced group. So most of the time you get neutral fluctuations. You can also get a rapid rise to early rise to a characteristic frequency, but you don't really get an S curve. You get something that looks more like the R curve that I mentioned before, with rapid rise and then slowing it down. So there's a way to do this that I came up with and made it work, which is you have a very strict, what I call the choo-choo train model. The leaders start the innovation, the early adopters listen only to the leaders and then adopt their innovation. The next group listens only to the early adopters and then adopts it, and all the way down to the laggards who are the last, only do it when the group just ahead of them. So it's like you're only paying attention to the group that's just ahead of you in this sort of social ranking of like who's fashionable in the way they speak. So it's a very strict structure that, is that really true? Well, we're just trying to see if it's possible with weighted interactive selection. So it is possible to produce an S-curve, as you can see from this top one. It's very highly, that's when the distribution is very highly skewed towards laggards. There's lots of laggards. If you get a bell-shaped distribution where you have a few leaders, a lot of people in the middle, and a few laggards, then it's more like the R curve again. And if you have a uniform distribution of innovativeness, so the number of leaders, middle groups, and laggards is the same, the subgroups are all the same in population, then you get something that's more like the R curve again. So those won't work. So you need to have a model where it's skewed towards the population group sizes are skewed towards the later groups in it. There's minimal one leader, tiny handful leader, progressively larger groups following them. So this is a case where we would say, here's a mechanism that can do it, but only under very special circumstances. And then we ask, do those circumstances actually hold in reality? So it's possible only if the relative size of the adopter groups increases, not just increases, but increases exponentially from the leaders down to the laggards. So what evidence is there for that type of pattern? Doesn't look very good. When you have these observed cases with, these are small samples of people who are tracked in language change, so same speakers over time. You can see that the Sankoff and Blondeau study of the Montreal R variable, the exponential is that black line, rising towards the laggards, and the actual one actually declines until you get to the laggards. But it's a very small number of speakers, as you can see from the y-axis of the graph. For the work by Nevelayan et al., we're also dealing with a very small number of speakers. You can see the exponential line in black there, rising up from progressive to conservative groups. But for the different kinds of changes in the history of English that they studied, you can see that they're wildly different, and none of them actually look like an exponential ranking. These are two very small studies, so that you can't really extrapolate from that. But we also know more generally, at least for the kinds of societies that have been studied by sociolinguists, that younger people and females tend to be the leaders or early adopters, and older males are the laggards for many types of language change. So this seems like a more general phenomenon that we can attribute fairly reliably to these demographic characteristics. So in other words, the community demographics would have to be highly skewed towards older people and towards males, which is actually far from the typical demographic distribution. So this shows basically age gender pyramids for population in two kind of typical situations. One, like in Africa back in 30 years ago, when you had young populations and not high levels of mortality at older ages. And you'll see that it's only the older people, or the numbers are much smaller, even though at the highest thing there is some of prevalence for males. In the US population in 2000, you have this sort of fatter pyramid. It's not even a pyramid much anymore, because you have, because of technology, medical technology, you have still fairly equal distribution of males and females at the different age categories, actually females presiding at the older ages, but you get this kind of bulge in the middle and much higher numbers at the high end of the age range. But this is what the age gender pyramid would look like for an exponential adopter groups, the kind that make an S-curve happen with weighted interactive selection. And first, it's an upside down pyramid, and second, as you get to the top, wider part of the pyramid, the males well outnumber the females. And there's really no society where it has this kind of demographic spread. So that suggests to us that even though mathematically, under the right conditions, you can produce an S-curve, empirically, it's very unlikely that that's how the S-curve is produced, because we don't have societies with this kind of gender and age structure. So that's basically what I just said. Empirical patterns are very far from, the special circumstances are very far from the observed demographics. Another problem that arises is that two of these studies show that different individuals are leaders or followers for different changes in the same speech community. So it's not the case that we can have this choo-choo train model where there's a subgroup that's the leaders and another subgroup that's the early adopters and so on. It depends on the change. Different people are leading, different people are following. So it's not a general characteristic of a person's role in society. Replicator selection, very powerful, easy to get. If you have all speakers preferring innovation, you get the S-curve. Interestingly, even if you have some speakers, even if you have some speakers where they prefer the opposite, to the general trend, you still get an S-curve. It goes down to about 70%. So even you get up to 30% of the speakers not favoring the incoming variant. As long as you still got that 70%, it's going to beat it out in the end. So that's important because, again, it's not like this is super sensitive. I mean, obviously, if you get below 70%, then it doesn't happen. But once you get most speakers valuing one of the variants, it just takes over on an S-shaped trajectory. So we came to the conclusion that replicator selection produces this S-curve quite robustly. Individuals may have different weights in favor of the incoming variant, but even so, an overall S-curve will be produced. And one thing I also observed in the paper, but I didn't have a slide for, is that this S-curve works for the aggregate population, even if different, like socially, geographically, otherwise defined subgroups are not following the S-curve, or doing different things, or going up and down. As long as you have enough people who have a positive evaluation of a variant, some more so, some less so, some not, you'll still get the S-curve at the overall society level. So it's very robust. So there are a couple people that made alternative proposals, and I'll just mention these two, and then there's one I didn't make a slide for, which is rather interesting. So Kauhanen argued that a continuous generation model plus what he called a socialization algorithm that favors connecting new speakers to highly connected speakers leads to an S-curve. Now leave aside whether that's socially plausible, but it kind of sneaks in weighted interactive selection. Basically, the highly connected features are like the early adopter group. And he only measures the monotonicity of an increase. He doesn't actually look, so it could be an R curve, it could be a J curve, it could be an S curve. So it doesn't actually express that. It does suggest that measuring how S-like the curve is would be useful, trying to fit an empirically observed pattern to a mathematical equation. And we didn't have continuous generation in that model, but we've used it for lots of other models, and we have no other reason to think that our result would be different. Another paper that appeared in Nature argued that the linguistic data should be binned, lumped together over a time interval. And if you bin that fluctuating neutral trajectory that fixes, that will make it look like an S-curve. But unfortunately, that's only true of some neutral trajectories reaching fixation. Others will still display fluctuations, but we don't observe that empirically. And also then you have stable variation, another sociolinguistic phenomenon, however it is conditioned, and that doesn't fluctuate. Nevertheless, an algorithm that they designed may be useful for measuring the amount of noise in an S-curve, which the noise may be fluctuations that are due to other processes. So there's some useful tools here, but I don't think that it undermines our general result. Interestingly, however, Richard Blythe with his colleagues at Edinburgh, Kenny Smith and let's see, now I can't remember the name of the other one. Simon Kirby, the fairly prominent group of language change modelers and experimentalists there. And the lead author was a person in the group named Stabler, showed that, you remember I said that frequency-dependent selection doesn't work very well. Either you can't get it up to over 50%, and if you get it over to 50%, it shoots up, or else if you leave it boost the minority variant, then they just settle on at 50-50. Well, if you make the speakers, instead of being sensitive to the frequency of occurrence of variance, to the rate of change in the frequency in a short time window, then you can get an S-shaped curve. And for a usage-based modeler, that's not out of question. It's not, the whole point of usage-based theorizing about linguistic knowledge is that speakers are tracking frequencies very carefully. So tracking the rate of frequency change might be something that speakers are doing. So I wouldn't say this rules it out. They actually published this 10 years ago, and even Richard hasn't really acted on it, so I guess maybe there are other issues that led them not to. Okay, I have a short thing. This is a short discussion based on unpublished work that didn't get continued, and I've kind of been nagging them to get back into it because I think it's interesting. So the question is, a linguistic variant, a particular pronunciation or a particular word or construction form, they don't have any inherent social value. That has to be conferred on them by speakers. And so the logical explanation, which I suggested in my book and Leboff separately suggested in his book, published around the same time, is that basically a particular pronunciation gets its social value because it's associated with a particular group of speakers who have a social, where we have a positive social attitude. So in other words, somehow they transfer the weighting of the speakers, that is weighted interactor selection, to the weighting of the variants that are most commonly used by those speakers. And so when they transfer it, it's replicator selection. So, sort of an obvious idea, so two different linguists came up with this idea independently about the same time. And so the model my colleagues proposed was to basically have a little bit of that sort of speaker attitude rub off on the variant as that speakers of the positively valued speakers produce those variants. So in other words, you're always getting a little extra. This is a very mathematician way of thinking of it. I never thought of it that way, but once I saw it, I thought, oh yeah, that sounds reasonable. A little bit rubs off, so every time you basically adjust the replicator selection to reflect the speaker's thing. So there's our model. So they added in replicator selection, and we get the weight from Hij rubbing off into that S variable. And that was actually, adding that replicator selection was an extension to the original model. I showed it in a slide before with it already plugged in. So this is sort of a slide, but then it shows this, the way, the equation they used to essentially get a simple way to get the weighted interactor selection value to rub off onto the replicator selection. But then what turned out to be interesting about this, what was rubbing off, is that it looked like you could get like dialect differentiation. So you basically have in-group and out-group. You have some speakers that are more strongly connected, interact with each other more often, and then with other speakers less often. And then there's this over-accommodation phenomenon, which I don't recall exactly how it works, which amplifies that difference, and then it leads to replicator selection, leading to a variant being used more frequently and taking over. So here's the interesting thing, is that there was a portion of Facebook, so somehow a group of researchers was able to get Facebook to essentially tell us what the social network was of part of Facebook at that time. And they could use that to model it. And the interesting thing about it is these kind of physicists who model different kinds of network structures, you know, for different, they have a kind of standard kinds of network structures they produce, but the one that actually occurred in Facebook was not one of the ones they normally produced. It was essentially you had a series of groups that were very dense, so you can see that, and then there were just sparse connections between those various dense groups. And then the interesting thing about this was that the sparse connections led to a sort of tree or star structure, you know, branching out and out. So it wasn't like all of these dense groups are interconnected sparsely with all the other dense groups. And then that led to, they had two different variants, the purple and the red, and as you see, different groups ended up fixating on either the purple or the red. So you got this kind of dialect differentiation where you had a dense groups that were loosely, very sparsely connected to other groups, which reflected the reality of a part of Facebook. So it's an empirically determined network. So inclusion of a replicator weight allows small spontaneous differences between groups to be amplified and then maintained, and specific features of social network structures. So this is a study, a phenomenon where the social network structure mattered a lot. So you have to have strong, dense local ties, but a sparse and tree-like network of connections at that group level. It's unclear whether this, at the point that they didn't ever finish this project, whether it allows for low-frequency innovations to propagate. Innovation will typically start out with a low replicator selection weight in this picture. So we'll stop there. Thank you very much. I'm assuming that you can ask questions. We do have a small audience today in person, so I don't know if any of you have questions. We do have a few minutes. The mic's over there. I don't know if it's hooked up. It is. It is.
Thank you very much. I was curious, the charts that you showed us with the shape that could be either an S shape or some other shapes, which data were they based on? Were all the charts based on the New Zealand English data, or was it something else?
Well, those things with the different shapes, that was from the S-curve paper, not the New Zealand English study. New Zealand English study didn't look at the trajectory of the change, it just looked at how quickly it could happen. In the trajectory paper, those are all models. So the models that include or don't include it. The observations, as I mentioned, the observations always have a pretty, good S-curve shape, and the only differences you find are cases where the change is truncated, and presumably that's, in hindsight, we would say that something happened to the replicator's selection weight, that it used to be positive and now it's negative, or the majority of speakers or the more than 30% of the speakers decided to go a different way, and that halted that thing, so you get a truncated S-curve. So those are the only two empirically observed patterns that we found. And it's somewhat crude. Of course, real data is going to be a little noisy. And I mentioned at the end that one of these papers that was trying to find a way to get an S-curve without replicator selection, they did suggest in that, some mathematical means to essentially deal, or at least analyze out the noise in an observed S curve, or to compare an S curve to a J curve or an R curve. Because, you look at it, the real data, the real data always, it was, all the data that I found was pretty clearly S-shaped, not R or J-shaped. So I would say, yeah, but the actual graphs I showed you, except the very first two, which were to illustrate actual changes, were all made from the model.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question they want to ask? Okay, well, I guess we will end for now, and after lunch, which means around 2:30, we will reconvene, and I will continue with a couple more studies, well, actually sort of a bunch of studies, shorter studies of using our model to deal with various sociolinguistic hypotheses. And then I'll conclude with talking about generation of variation, where I'm basically going to show you the linguistic mechanisms we have and then talk about how we would try to model them. So thank you, and we'll see everybody online at, so to speak, at 2:30.